"Excuse me, sir, but you're in my seat." The voice cut through the quiet hum of Skybridge Airlines Flight 447's first-class cabin like a blade through silk. Damon Mitchell didn't open his eyes immediately. He had been settling into the familiar rhythm of pre-flight preparation, the kind that comes after 2 decades of business travel. But this voice, nasally and dripping with the kind of entitlement that money couldn't buy but status could corrupt, made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Damon opened his eyes slowly, deliberately. Standing in the aisle was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog from 1987. Navy blazer with gold buttons, khaki pants pressed to military precision, and brown loafers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His face was flushed. Whether from the airport lounge whiskey or the indignation of having his routine disrupted, Damon couldn't tell. "Can I help you?" Damon asked, his voice carrying the kind of calm that came from boardrooms where billions changed hands with handshakes. "You're in my seat," the man repeated, not bothering to check his boarding pass. "1A. I always sit in 1A. Damon glanced at his phone, where his digital boarding pass displayed clearly. Seat 1A, Skybridge Airlines Flight 447, Miami to London. He had purchased this ticket 4 hours ago for $14,500, a premium that could have bought a decent used car, but time was more valuable than money when you were racing across an ocean to finalize a merger that would reshape 2 industries. "This is 1A, Damon said, his tone measured. "And I have the boarding pass for 1A. The man's face reddened further. "I'm Preston Howard, Distinction Platinum member. Does that ring a bell?" It didn't. Damon had never heard of Preston Howard, and in his world, if you mattered, he would know your name. But he didn't say that. Instead, he simply replied, "Check your boarding pass, Preston. You might be in 1B. "I don't do window seats," Preston snapped, his voice rising enough to draw glances from other passengers. "I need aisle access for my legs. I have a condition." Damon looked at Preston's legs, which appeared perfectly functional, then back at his face. "I understand medical needs," he said quietly. "But I paid for this specific seat, and I'm not moving because you prefer it." The cabin fell into that peculiar silence that comes when conflict begins to brew in confined spaces. In seat 2B, Dr. Sarah Kim, a cardiac surgeon returning from a medical conference in Miami, looked up from her journal. She was Korean-American, in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made her one of the most sought-after specialists on the East Coast. Something about this exchange felt wrong to her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. In 3A, Miguel Santos shifted uncomfortably. He was a successful contractor from Dallas, flying to London to bid on a major infrastructure project. He'd worked his way up from construction sites to corporate boardrooms, and he recognized the tone Preston was using. It was the same tone his old bosses had used when they wanted to remind him of his place. Behind them, in 2C, Robert Hayes was trying to ignore the situation entirely. He was a partner at a prestigious law firm, and his experience told him that airplane disputes were rarely worth the energy. But something about the man in the hoodie intrigued him. There was a stillness to him, a quality that spoke of power held in check. That man was Damon Mitchell, though none of them knew it yet. At 42, he had built Meridian Financial Group from a small investment firm into a powerhouse that controlled over $7 billion in debt portfolios across multiple industries. Aviation was his specialty, and Skybridge Airlines was his current target. Not for destruction, but for transformation. The irony was almost poetic. For 6 months, Damon had been quietly acquiring Skybridge's debt, preparing for a takeover that would save the struggling airline from bankruptcy. His private jet, a Gulfstream G650 that he'd nicknamed Dignity, was currently grounded at Teterboro for hydraulic maintenance. The London merger meeting with European partners couldn't wait. So here he was, flying commercial on the very airline he was planning to own. His attire was deliberate. A charcoal Brunello Cucinelli hoodie that cost more than most people's monthly salary, dark jeans that were tailored to perfection, and white sneakers that looked casual but carried a four-figure price tag. On his wrist was a Richard Mille watch, one of only 50 ever made, worth more than most houses. But to the untrained eye, he looked like any other successful professional traveling in comfort. Preston Howard couldn't see past the hoodie. "Look," Preston said, his voice taking on a condescending tone. "I've been flying Skybridge for 15 years. I know how this works. You're probably an upgrade, right? Miles redemption? Somebody canceled and you got lucky?" Damon felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger. Anger was for people who didn't understand power. This was recognition. He had seen this dance before, in corporate boardrooms and country clubs, in restaurants and hotels. The assumption that success couldn't possibly wear a hoodie, especially on a black man. "I paid full fare," Damon said simply. $14,500. 4 hours ago. Preston laughed, a harsh sound that carried too far in the quiet cabin. "Right. And I'm sure you have the receipt to prove it." "I do." Damon's phone buzzed with a notification from his assistant. Elena Vasquez, his right hand for the past 8 years, was checking in. Acquisition team standing by. London partners confirmed for morning meeting. "Shall I proceed with final documentation?" Damon dismissed the notification without responding. "Not yet." Dr. Kim was now openly watching the exchange. Something about Preston's tone, the way he kept emphasizing certain words, made her medical training kick in. She was seeing the symptoms of something ugly, and her instinct was to document it. She quietly pulled out her phone and opened her camera app, not to record yet, but to be ready. Miguel Santos was thinking about his daughter, Sophia, who was starting college next month. He'd worked 60-hour weeks for 20 years to afford her education, to give her opportunities he'd never had. But he'd taught her that respect was earned through character, not demanded through status. Preston Howard was demonstrating the difference. Is there a problem here? The voice belonged to Carmen Rodriguez, the lead flight attendant for first class. She was 35, a 12-year veteran of the skies who had seen every possible passenger dispute. She approached with the practiced smile of someone who had learned to diffuse tensions while maintaining professionalism. But Carmen was also carrying baggage that wasn't in the overhead compartments. Skybridge was struggling financially, and rumors of layoffs were constant. Management had made it clear that keeping high-status passengers happy was crucial to the airline's survival. Preston Howard was a Distinction Platinum member who flew internationally twice a month. The man in the hoodie was a face she didn't recognize. "Carmen!" Preston's voice brightened as he read her name tag. "Thank God. Can you help me here?" "There's been some kind of computer error. This gentleman is in my seat." Carmen looked at Damon, taking in the hoodie, the casual posture, the expensive watch that she didn't recognize. Her mental calculation was swift. Preston Howard equals known quantity, frequent flyer, complaint-prone but valuable. Mystery man in hoodie equals unknown, possibly problematic, probably upgrade passenger. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked Damon, her tone professional but cool. Damon held up his phone, displaying the digital pass clearly. Carmen glanced at it, but didn't scan it or examine it closely. In her mind, she was already planning the solution. Move the upgrade passenger to accommodate the paying customer. "Mr. Howard, let me check your seat assignment," she said, turning to Preston. Preston pulled out his phone with theatrical flourish. 1A, just like always. "See? The system put this gentleman in my seat by mistake." Carmen looked at Preston's boarding pass. 1B, window seat. Exactly what he claimed he couldn't tolerate. But Carmen was tired. She'd been working double shifts to cover for colleagues who had already been laid off. She'd seen Preston Howard throw tantrums before, and she knew he would make the next 6 hours miserable if he didn't get what he wanted. The man in the hoodie seemed calm, reasonable. Surely he would understand. "Sir," she said to Damon, "there seems to be a double booking situation. Would you be willing to move to another seat? We have a lovely spot in 3D, and I'd be happy to offer you a complimentary upgrade to our premium beverage service." The words hung in the air like smoke. Damon felt them settle around him, recognizing them for what they were, the language of institutional bias dressed up as customer service. "There's no double booking," Damon said quietly. "I have seat 1A. He has seat 1B. The only confusion is in his expectation that his preference should override my contract." Carmen's smile flickered. She wasn't used to passengers who spoke like lawyers, especially passengers in hoodies. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but Mr. Howard is a valued loyalty member." "And what am I?" Damon interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying a new weight. "What exactly do you see when you look at me?" The question was simple, but it cut through all the corporate speak and polite deflection. Carmen felt herself trapped between honest answer and diplomatic response. What she saw was a young black man in casual clothes who probably didn't belong in first class. What she said was, "I see a passenger who I'm trying to accommodate." "No," Damon said, shaking his head slightly. "You see someone you think you can move, someone whose comfort matters less than his." He nodded toward Preston. "That's not accommodation. That's something else entirely." Dr. Kim was no longer pretending to read her journal. She was watching intently, her phone now openly visible, thumb hovering over the record button. Something was building here, something that felt important. Miguel Santos had closed his laptop. His business training told him to stay neutral, but his father's lessons told him something different. He thought about the times he'd been questioned in hotel lobbies, asked if he was sure he belonged there. He thought about his daughter and what he wanted her to see in the world. Robert Hayes was beginning to pay attention despite himself. He practiced corporate law, and he knew discrimination when he saw it. This wasn't about seat assignments. This was about assumptions. Preston Howard, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him, saw Carmen's hesitation as weakness. "Look, Carmen, I don't want to make this difficult, but I can't sit in a window seat. It's a medical condition. Claustrophobia. My doctor can provide documentation if needed." Carmen nodded gratefully, seizing on the medical angle. "Of course, Mr. Howard." "Sir," she turned back to Damon, "given Mr. Howard's medical needs, would you be willing to accommodate—" "No." The word came out quietly, but with the finality of a judge's gavel. Damon looked directly at Carmen, then at Preston. "I have no medical condition preventing me from sitting in this seat. He has no medical documentation requiring this specific seat. This is about preference, not necessity. And preference doesn't override purchase." Carmen felt the walls closing in. She needed this situation resolved before the captain got involved, before other passengers started complaining about delays. She needed Preston Howard happy and the flight on schedule. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist that you relocate. We can offer you 2,000 bonus miles as compensation for the inconvenience." Damon studied her face, seeing the tiredness, the pressure, the unconscious bias that made this decision feel reasonable to her. He felt sorry for Carmen Rodriguez, because she was about to become part of a story she hadn't chosen to write. "Carmen," he said, using her name for the first time, "I'm going to ask you to think very carefully about your next decision. This moment is going to matter more than you realize." Something in his tone made Carmen pause. There was no threat in it, no anger, but there was a weight that seemed to fill the cabin. For a second, she wondered if she was missing something important. But Preston Howard's impatient sigh broke the spell. "Carmen, please. I have a dinner in London that I cannot be late for. Just move him." Carmen took a deep breath and made the choice that would change everything. "Sir, I need you to gather your belongings and move to seat 3D, or I'll have to call the captain." Damon looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Call the captain," he said. "Let's make sure everyone understands exactly what's happening here." Carmen's face flushed. She hadn't expected compliance, but she also hadn't expected this quiet challenge. "Sir, you don't want to escalate this situation." "Carmen," Damon said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "This situation escalated the moment you decided that my $14,000 seat was negotiable because of how I look. I'm not escalating anything. I'm just refusing to pretend that's normal." Behind them, Dr. Kim's thumb moved to the record button. The red dot appeared on her screen. Miguel Santos straightened in his seat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to speak up when it mattered. "I couldn't help but overhear. Did I understand correctly that this gentleman has seat 1A and Mr. Howard has 1B? Carmen turned, grateful for any interruption. "Yes, but there's a medical—" "So there's no actual double booking," Miguel continued. "It's just a preference for aisle versus window?" Preston whipped around. "It's not a preference, it's a medical condition. I get claustrophobic in window seats." Robert Hayes, the lawyer, finally spoke up. "What's the documentation for that condition?" "Because requesting accommodation under the ADA requires actual medical certification, not just verbal claims." Preston's face went red. "I don't need to prove anything to you people." The words hung in the air. "You people." Dr. Kim's camera captured it all. Damon remained perfectly still in his seat, watching the scene unfold with the patience of someone who understood that the truth had a way of revealing itself if you gave it time. "Carmen," he said finally, "you have 2 paying passengers with confirmed seat assignments. One is in the correct seat, one is not. The solution seems obvious unless there's a factor you haven't mentioned." Carmen felt trapped. Every corporate training session had taught her to avoid confrontation with high-status passengers. But every human instinct was telling her that something was wrong with this picture. I'll need to get the captain," she said finally, retreating toward the cockpit. As she walked away, Damon pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to Elena. "Flight delayed. Proceed with London backup plan. We may need to accelerate timeline." Elena's response came immediately. "Understood. Legal team on standby. Acquisition documentation ready for immediate execution." Damon smiled slightly as he put his phone away. He looked around the cabin at the faces watching him. Some sympathetic, some curious, some uncomfortable. They had no idea they were witnessing the opening act of a $5 billion lesson in dignity. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Blake Morrison emerged, his 4 gold stripes catching the cabin light like armor. He was 58 years old, a veteran of 30 years in the cockpit who remembered when passengers dressed up to fly and flight attendants were called stewardesses. He believed in order, hierarchy, and the chain of command that had kept him alive through 3 decades of commercial aviation. Carmen whispered urgently in his ear, gesturing back toward seat 1A. Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, taking in the hooded figure who was causing problems for his flight. He adjusted his hat and walked down the short aisle, his heavy shoes deliberate against the cabin floor. When he reached row 1, he looked down at Damon with the authority of someone who was accustomed to absolute obedience at 37,000 feet. "Son," he began, his voice carrying the weight of rank, "I understand you're refusing to follow crew member instructions." Damon looked up calmly. "I'm not your son, Captain, and I'm not refusing to follow instructions. I'm sitting in the seat I purchased, waiting for someone to explain why that's a problem." Captain Morrison felt the subtle challenge in the response. In his world, passengers didn't question crew decisions. They certainly didn't speak with the quiet confidence he was hearing from the man in seat 1A. "Sir," he corrected, though the condescension remained. "My flight attendant tells me there's a seating dispute that's delaying my aircraft. That's unacceptable. We have a schedule to maintain." "Then I suggest you maintain it," Damon replied. "I'm not delaying anything. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Around them, the cabin had gone quiet. Other passengers were openly watching now, sensing that something important was happening. The tension was building like pressure in the cabin, and everyone could feel it. Captain Morrison looked at Preston Howard, taking in the expensive suit, the confident posture, the obvious markers of success and status. Then he looked back at Damon, seeing the hoodie, the casual demeanor, the calm defiance that felt threatening to his authority. "Mr. Howard is a valued frequent flyer with medical needs," the captain said. "My crew has the authority to reassign seating for safety and comfort reasons." "Show me the regulation," Damon said quietly. "Chapter and verse." "Because I'm familiar with the FAA guidelines and passenger reassignment requires either safety concerns or documented medical necessity. Which category does Mr. Howard's preference fall into?" Captain Morrison stiffened. Passengers weren't supposed to know regulations. They certainly weren't supposed to quote them back at him. "Are you refusing to comply with crew member instructions?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "I'm asking for clarification of the instruction," Damon replied. "What exactly am I being instructed to do, and under what authority?" The question hung in the air like a challenge flag. Dr. Kim's camera was still rolling, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of this confrontation that felt like it was about much more than airline seats. Miguel Santos was thinking about his own experiences with authority, about the times he'd been told to move along, to know his place, to not cause trouble. He was thinking about his daughter, about the world he wanted her to inherit. Robert Hayes was thinking about precedent, about the legal implications of what he was witnessing. His lawyer's mind was already cataloging potential violations, and Damon Mitchell was thinking about dignity, about the price of silence, about the moment when someone has to decide whether comfort is worth more than principle, the moment when a $5 billion lesson was about to begin. Captain Morrison straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of every passenger's eyes on him. In 30 years of flying, he had never had a passenger challenge him on regulations. His authority was absolute in this aluminum tube, and this man in the hoodie was testing boundaries that Morrison had never had questioned. "Sir, I don't need to provide you with regulatory citations," Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone he used for unruly passengers. "My crew has identified a situation that needs resolution. You can cooperate, or we can resolve this another way." "What other way would that be, Captain?" Damon asked, his voice remaining perfectly level. "Because the only way I leave this seat is if you can demonstrate I'm violating federal law or airline policy, neither of which has happened." Preston Howard stepped closer, emboldened by the captain's presence. "Look, this is ridiculous. I've been flying this route for 15 years. I always sit in 1A. The computer must have glitched or something, but Carmen knows I need the aisle seat." "Mr. Howard," Dr. Kim interjected, her medical training making her uncomfortable with false claims. "Earlier you mentioned claustrophobia as a medical condition. As a physician, I should point out that documented medical conditions require formal accommodation requests, usually submitted during booking." Preston's face reddened. "I don't need to explain my medical history to strangers. You do if you're using it to justify displacing another passenger," Robert Hayes added, his legal training kicking in. "Medical accommodations have specific protocols under federal law." Captain Morrison felt the situation slipping away from him. What should have been a simple passenger reassignment was turning into a legal debate with witnesses who seemed surprisingly well informed. "This is not a courtroom," Morrison said sharply. "This is my aircraft, and I have the authority to ensure passenger safety and comfort." "Sir," He turned back to Damon. Final warning. Move to the seat my crew has assigned, or you'll be removed from this aircraft. Damon looked up at the captain with eyes that had seen hostile takeovers, boardroom battles, and corporate warfare. He had learned long ago that real power didn't need to announce itself with threats. "Captain Morrison," he said, reading the nameplate on the uniform, "you're about to make a decision that will be remembered for the rest of your career. I want to make sure you understand the implications." Something in Damon's tone made Morrison pause. It wasn't anger or frustration, emotions he was used to dealing with in difficult passengers. It was the quiet certainty of someone who knew something the captain didn't. "Are you threatening me?" Morrison asked, though uncertainty was creeping into his voice. "I'm offering perspective," Damon replied. "In 5 minutes, you're going to learn something about the passenger you're considering removing. I suggest you might want to verify who you're dealing with before you escalate this situation." Carmen Rodriguez stood near the galley, watching the standoff with growing anxiety. Her shift supervisor had made it clear that any complaints from Distinction Platinum members would be noted in personnel files. With rumors of layoffs circulating daily, she couldn't afford to have Preston Howard writing angry letters to corporate. But something about this situation felt wrong. The man in seat 1A wasn't acting like someone who was caught in a lie or trying to scam an upgrade. He was acting like someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Carmen!" Preston called out. "Can you please just handle this? I have medication I need to take and I can't do it in a window seat." Dr. Kim looked up sharply. "What medication requires aisle access specifically?" Preston fumbled for words. It's a privacy matter. Most medications don't have seating requirements," Dr. Kim continued, her professional curiosity aroused. "Are we talking about an emergency injection device? Mobility issues? Because if you have genuine medical needs, the crew should document them properly." Miguel Santos was watching Preston's body language, recognizing the tells of someone caught in an expanding lie. He'd seen it in construction sites when foremen made up safety violations to move workers they didn't want in certain areas. "Look," Preston said, his voice rising with frustration, "I don't need to justify myself to a bunch of strangers. Carmen, I fly this route twice a month. I spend $60,000 a year with this airline. This guy probably got a last-minute upgrade. Just move him." The casual dismissal hung in the air. This guy. Dr. Kim's camera caught every word, every gesture, every assumption that Preston was making about the man in seat 1A. Damon remained perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with the patience of someone who had learned that people often revealed their true character when they thought they had power. "Mr. Howard," Damon said quietly, "you keep mentioning your spending with this airline. What exactly do you think that entitles you to?" "It entitles me to the seat I always sit in," Preston snapped. "It entitles me to customer service that recognizes loyalty. It entitles me to not having my routine disrupted by someone who doesn't understand how this works." "How what works?" Miguel Santos asked, his voice carrying the edge of someone who had heard similar language before. "How airline seating works? Because my understanding is that you buy a ticket for a specific seat, and that seat is yours. Pretty simple." Preston turned on Miguel with obvious irritation. "You people don't understand the loyalty system. Distinction. Platinum members have privileges. You people," Robert Hayes repeated, his lawyer's instinct picking up on the phrase. "What people would those be, Mr. Howard?" Preston's mouth opened and closed, realizing he'd said something that sounded worse than he'd intended. "I meant passengers who don't fly frequently, people who don't understand the system." But the damage was done. The phrase "you people" had escaped twice now, and everyone in first class had heard it. Dr. Kim's recording captured the context, the tone, the obvious implications. Captain Morrison felt control slipping away completely. What had started as a simple passenger dispute was becoming something larger, more complex, with legal and public relations implications he hadn't anticipated. "Everyone needs to calm down," Morrison said, trying to reassert authority. "Mr. Howard, return to your assigned seat, sir." He looked at Damon. "I need to see your identification and boarding documentation." Damon reached into his jacket and pulled out his passport and phone. He handed the passport to Morrison and displayed his boarding pass clearly. "Damon Mitchell, seat 1A, full fare ticket purchased 4 hours ago." Morrison opened the passport, and his eyes widened slightly as he read the occupation listed. Executive, Financial Services. The passport was diplomatic black, the kind issued to people with significant international business interests. "Mr. Mitchell," Morrison said, his tone shifting slightly, "there seems to be some confusion about seating assignments. Perhaps we can resolve this amicably." "There's no confusion, Captain," Damon replied. "I have seat 1A. Mr. Howard has seat 1B. The only issue is his refusal to sit in the seat he purchased." Preston Howard watched the captain's body language change and felt panic rising. "Carmen, you said there was a double booking. You said the system made an error." Carmen looked uncomfortable. I thought there might be a system error." "You thought?" Damon repeated softly. "Based on what evidence?" Carmen felt every eye in first class on her. The honest answer was that she'd assumed the black man in the hoodie couldn't possibly have paid full fare for 1A. But she couldn't say that. She couldn't even acknowledge thinking it. "Sometimes upgrades get processed incorrectly," she said weakly. "Show me the upgrade," Damon said, "in the system. Show me where my ticket was processed as anything other than a full-fare first-class purchase." Carmen's tablet was in her hands, but she didn't want to access the passenger manifest. She knew what it would show. She knew what it would prove. She knew she had made an assumption based on appearance, and now she was trapped by that assumption. "I don't need to show you system information," she said, falling back on corporate policy. "Then show Captain Morrison," Damon suggested. "Let him verify whether there was actually a system error or whether this is about something else entirely." Morrison was beginning to understand that he was in the middle of a situation that could go very badly for everyone involved. The passenger in seat 1A wasn't backing down, wasn't getting angry, wasn't giving him any reason to remove him beyond the complaints of another passenger. "Carmen, let me see the manifest," Morrison said quietly. Carmen reluctantly handed over her tablet. Morrison scrolled through the passenger list, finding Damon Mitchell's entry. Full fare, purchased 4 hours earlier. No upgrade notation, no special handling required. Seat 1A assigned at time of purchase. He looked at Preston Howard's entry. Seat 1B, distinction platinum status. No medical accommodation requests on file. Morrison handed the tablet back to Carmen without comment, but his expression had changed. He was a veteran pilot who had seen passenger disputes before, but he had never been in a situation where the crew had so clearly mishandled the initial assessment. "Mr. Howard," Morrison said carefully, "your assigned seat is 1B. Mr. Mitchell's assigned seat is 1A. If you have specific medical needs that require aisle access, we'll need proper documentation." Preston felt the ground shifting beneath him. "I've been a loyal customer for 15 years. This is how you treat me?" "This is how we treat all customers," Dr. Kim said firmly, "according to the same rules and policies." "Carmen told me there was a system error," Preston insisted, his voice getting louder. "She said the computer made a mistake." Carmen felt the weight of 30 passengers' attention on her. She had made an assumption, and now she was being forced to own it or double down on it. "There was confusion about the seating," she said carefully. "What kind of confusion?" Robert Hayes asked, his legal training making him push for specifics. "Computer errors leave digital trails. Booking mistakes have documentation. What exactly was confusing about 2 passengers having 2 different seat assignments?" The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand what wasn't being said. Carmen had looked at a black man in a hoodie and assumed he didn't belong in first class. Preston had looked at the same man and assumed his own status entitled him to override another passenger's purchase. Captain Morrison had looked at the situation and assumed the crew member must be right, and now all of those assumptions were colliding with reality in front of a cabin full of witnesses, at least one of whom was recording everything. "I want to file a complaint," Preston announced. "This is unacceptable customer service. I'm being discriminated against because I'm a frequent flyer." Miguel Santos almost laughed out loud. "You think you're being discriminated against?" "Yes. This man is getting preferential treatment just to spite a loyal customer." "He's getting the seat he paid for," Dr. Kim said, her voice sharp with medical precision. "That's not preferential treatment. That's basic contract fulfillment." Damon watched the argument swirl around him, recognizing the patterns he'd seen in corporate boardrooms when bad decisions started cascading into worse ones. People got defensive, doubled down on mistakes, tried to justify the unjustifiable rather than admit error. His phone buzzed with another message from Elena. "London team reports Skybridge stock down 3% in after-hours trading. Debt restructuring proceeding as planned. Ready to accelerate acquisition timeline on your signal." Damon looked at the message and made a decision. He typed back, "Document everything. Legal team to standby. Preparing for full acceleration." Elena's response was immediate. "Understood." Thunderbolt protocol activated. Damon put his phone away and looked up at Captain Morrison. "Captain, I'm going to make this very simple. I have done nothing wrong. I have violated no policies. I have broken no laws. I am sitting in the seat I purchased with my own money. If you remove me from this aircraft, you will be violating federal regulations regarding passenger rights, and you will be doing so in front of multiple witnesses who are documenting this incident." Morrison felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool cabin air. He was beginning to realize that this passenger knew more about aviation law than most of his flight attendants. "Moreover," Damon continued, his voice still perfectly calm, "you will be making a decision based solely on another passenger's preference to override the seating system. That's not safety. That's not policy. That's discrimination based on assumption." The word hung in the air like a smoking gun. Discrimination. Every airline employee knew that word meant lawyers, investigations, media attention, and career-ending consequences. Preston Howard felt panic rising as he realized the situation was slipping away from him. "This is insane. All I want is the aisle seat. I have medical needs." "Then document them," Robert Hayes said firmly. "File the proper accommodation request. Follow the actual procedure instead of demanding special treatment." "I don't have time for procedures," Preston snapped. "I have a dinner in London that cost me $5,000 to arrange. I need to be on this flight, and I need to be comfortable." "And Mr. Mitchell doesn't deserve the same consideration?" Dr. Kim asked. "His comfort doesn't matter because you decided yours matters more?" Damon stood up slowly, his full height imposing in the confined space. "Captain Morrison, you have a choice to make. You can acknowledge that two passengers have two different seat assignments and ask Mr. Howard to take his assigned seat. Or you can escalate the situation based on the assumption that my presence in first class is somehow more problematic than his demands to override airline policy." Morrison looked at Damon, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the expensive clothes disguised as casual wear. He saw the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. He saw the diplomatic passport and the body language of someone who wasn't intimidated by uniforms or titles. But Morrison also saw 30 years of aviation culture that had taught him to trust his crew, to maintain order, and to avoid the kind of confrontation that could spiral out of control. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat while we sort this out," Morrison said, trying to find middle ground. "I am in my seat," Damon replied. I've been in my seat this entire time. The only person not in their assigned seat is Mr. Howard." Preston, sensing the captain's uncertainty, played his final card. "Fine. I'll call corporate. I'll call my contact in the executive office. This is exactly the kind of service problem that's killing this airline." It was the wrong thing to say at the wrong time. Carmen had been thinking the same thing, that customer service failures were contributing to Skybridge's financial problems. But hearing it from Preston's mouth, in the context of his demands to displace another passenger, made it sound like a threat. "Mr. Howard," Carmen said slowly, "perhaps you should try the window seat. Just for this flight." Preston's face went red. "Absolutely not. I paid for first class, and first class means getting the seat I need." "So did I," Damon said quietly. "The difference is that I'm asking for the seat I bought, not demanding someone else's." The standoff had reached its breaking point. Captain Morrison had to make a decision that would define how this situation ended. He could acknowledge that his crew had made an error in judgment, or he could double down and remove a passenger who had done nothing wrong. He looked around the cabin, seeing the faces of passengers who were waiting to see what kind of airline they were flying on, what kind of values it would demonstrate when tested, and then he made the choice that would cost Skybridge Airlines $5 billion. "Sir, I'm asking you one final time to relocate to another seat, or I'll have no choice but to call security." Damon looked at Morrison for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Call security, Captain. Let's see how this ends." As Morrison reached for the phone to contact ground security, Dr. Kim's finger found the record button on her phone. The red light began to blink. Miguel Santos pulled out his own phone, opening his social media app. Robert Hayes was already composing an email to his firm's civil rights division, and Damon Mitchell was sending one final message to Elena Vasquez. Proceed with full acquisition, no negotiations, no mercy. The $5 billion lesson was about to begin. Captain Morrison's hand hesitated over the intercom phone. 30 years of flying had taught him that once security was called, there was no going back. The situation would escalate beyond his control, become a matter of official record, involve federal authorities. But the alternative, backing down in front of a cabin full of passengers, felt like a surrender of the authority that had defined his entire career. He picked up the phone. "Ground security, this is Captain Morrison on Skybridge 447. I need assistance removing an uncooperative passenger from first class." The words echoed through the cabin with the finality of a judge's sentence. Dr. Kim's camera captured every syllable, every facial expression, every moment of the decision that would transform Skybridge Airlines forever. "Security is en route," Morrison announced to the cabin. "We'll have this resolved shortly, and then we can proceed with departure." Damon remained perfectly still in seat 1A, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm. But inside, he felt the familiar cold fire that had driven him through 20 years of corporate warfare. This wasn't about a seat anymore. This was about dignity, about the assumptions that divided people into categories of worthy and unworthy, about the moment when someone has to decide whether comfort is worth more than principle. "Captain Morrison," Damon said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the first-class cabin, "I want you to understand exactly what you're doing. You're calling security to remove a paying passenger who has committed no crime, violated no policy, and done nothing but sit in the seat he purchased. You're doing this because another passenger prefers a different seat, and because your crew made assumptions based on my appearance." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Sir, you're refusing crew member instructions. That's a federal offense." "What instruction am I refusing?" Damon asked. "The instruction to give up my seat to someone who wants it more?" "Show me that regulation, Captain." Chapter and verse. Miguel Santos was live tweeting the confrontation. "Watching Skybridge. Air call security on passenger for sitting in seat he paid $14,500 for. Other passenger just wants the seat more. This is insane. Skybridge shame. Dr. Kim was narrating quietly for her recording. Flight attendant Carmen Rodriguez assumed passenger in hoodie was upgrade mistake. Captain Morrison called security rather than ask the actual seat assignment holder to take his correct seat. This is racial profiling in action. Robert Hayes was already drafting legal notes on his phone, documenting potential federal civil rights violations, breach of contract, and discriminatory business practices. Preston Howard stood near the galley, arms crossed, watching vindication approach in the form of uniformed authority. In his mind, this was how the world was supposed to work. Status recognized, loyalty rewarded, order maintained. The man in the hoodie had challenged the natural hierarchy, and now the hierarchy was reasserting itself. Finally, Preston muttered to Carmen, "Some sanity." Carmen wasn't feeling vindicated. She was feeling sick. Watching Captain Morrison call security on a passenger who had been nothing but polite and reasonable made her realize how badly she had misread the situation. But it was too late to change course now. Too late to admit that she had made assumptions, that she had let bias cloud her professional judgment. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom. "Skybridge 447, you have security personnel approaching your aircraft. Please prepare to receive them at the forward door." Damon reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, placing it on the armrest where everyone could see it. "I'm documenting this interaction for legal purposes," he announced clearly. "Everyone should understand that what happens next is being recorded." Captain Morrison's face reddened. "Sir, you cannot record crew member interactions without consent." "Actually," Robert Hayes interjected from his seat, "federal aviation law permits passengers to record interactions with crew members when they believe their rights are being violated. It's established precedent." Morrison spun around to glare at Hayes. "Are you a lawyer?" "Partner at Morrison, Steinberg and Associates." Hayes replied calmly. 23 years specializing in transportation law, and this situation is about to become a federal case study in passenger rights violations." The forward door opened, and 3 security officers entered the aircraft. They were led by Officer Maria Lopez, a 10-year veteran of airport security who had seen every possible passenger dispute. Behind her were Officers James Park and David Williams, both experienced in handling aviation security incidents. Officer Lopez approached Captain Morrison, her expression professional but alert. She had learned to be cautious about crew member requests for passenger removal. Too many situations that seemed clear-cut from the captain's description turned out to be complex when she saw them firsthand. "Captain Morrison?" "I'm Officer Lopez. What's the situation here?" Morrison pointed toward Damon. "That passenger is refusing to comply with crew member instructions to relocate. He's being disruptive and delaying the flight." Lopez looked at Damon, seeing a well-dressed man sitting quietly in his seat, hands visible, posture relaxed. He didn't look disruptive. He looked like a business traveler waiting for his flight to depart. "What instructions is he refusing?" Lopez asked. "We need him to move to a different seat to accommodate another passenger with medical needs." Lopez walked over to Damon, studying him carefully. "Sir, can you tell me your version of what's happening?" "Officer Lopez," Damon said calmly, "I purchased seat 1A for $14,500 4 hours ago. I have my boarding pass, my identification, and my receipt. I've been sitting in this seat since I boarded. Another passenger prefers this seat and has asked the crew to move me to accommodate his preference. I've declined to give up the seat I paid for. That's the entire situation." Lopez looked back at Morrison. "Is this passenger's ticket valid for seat 1A?" Morrison hesitated. "Yes, but has he violated any federal regulations or airline policies?" Another hesitation. He's refusing crew member instructions. What specific instruction? To give up his seat to another passenger? Dr. Kim was recording the entire exchange, her medical training making her appreciate Officer Lopez's methodical approach to gathering facts. Miguel Santos was typing furiously on his phone. Security officer asking the right questions. Why is passenger being asked to give up seat he paid for? Captain can't answer. Justice. Watch Lopez walked over to Preston Howard. Sir, what's your seat assignment? Preston straightened, confident that authority would vindicate him. 1B, but I have a medical condition that requires aisle access. I always sit in 1A. The airline knows this. Do you have documentation of this medical condition on file with the airline? Preston's confidence wavered. It's been verbally communicated to the crew, but no formal accommodation request was submitted during booking. I shouldn't have to file paperwork for something this simple. I'm a Distinction Platinum member. Lopez had handled enough passenger disputes to recognize the difference between legitimate medical needs and entitled demands. She walked back to Captain Morrison. Captain, help me understand the legal basis for removing this passenger. He has a valid ticket for the seat he's occupying. The other passenger has a preference for that seat, but no documented medical accommodation on file. What regulation are we enforcing here? Morrison felt the situation slipping away completely. Officer, I don't question your expertise in security matters. Please don't question mine in aviation matters. I'm not questioning your expertise, Captain. I'm asking for the specific regulation that allows you to remove a passenger from his assigned seat to accommodate another passenger's undocumented preference. The silence stretched long enough for everyone in first class to understand that Captain Morrison had no answer because no such regulation existed. Carmen Rodriguez stepped forward, desperately trying to salvage the situation. Officer, there was confusion about the seating assignments. We're just trying to resolve it efficiently. What kind of confusion? Lopez asked. Computer error? Booking mistake? What specifically was confusing about two passengers having two different seat assignments? Carmen felt every eye in the cabin on her. The honest answer would destroy her career. The dishonest answer would make everything worse. I thought there might be a system error. Based on what evidence? Silence. Officer Lopez was beginning to understand what she was really looking at. She had seen this pattern before. Crew members making assumptions about passengers based on appearance, then escalating when those assumptions were challenged. Captain Morrison, she said formally, I cannot remove a passenger from his assigned seat without evidence of policy violation or security threat. This appears to be a civil dispute between passengers, not a security matter. Morrison's face went pale. Officer, I'm the captain of this aircraft. I have federal authority over passenger safety and security. You do, Captain, but that authority has to be exercised within federal guidelines. Removing a passenger requires justifiable cause. Preference isn't justifiable cause. Preston Howard watched his victory dissolving into humiliation. This is unbelievable. I spend $60,000 a year with this airline. And you can't even guarantee me a comfortable seat? Sir, Officer Lopez said patiently, spending money with an airline doesn't give you the right to another passenger's seat. It gives you the right to the seat you purchased. Dr. Kim continued recording, capturing Preston's growing desperation, the captain's increasing isolation, Carmen's obvious distress, and Damon's unwavering calm. There has to be a solution here, Morrison said desperately. We can't take off with this situation unresolved. The solution is simple, Miguel Santos called out from his seat. Mr. Howard takes seat 1B, which he paid for. Mr. Mitchell keeps seat 1A, which he paid for. Problem solved. I can't sit in a window seat, Preston insisted. It triggers my claustrophobia. Then perhaps, Dr. Kim said pointedly, you should have requested an aisle seat when you made your reservation. or submitted proper medical documentation for accommodation. I shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else? Robert Hayes interrupted. That's an interesting legal theory, Mr. Howard. Officer Lopez could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. She made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Captain Morrison, I'm recommending that you resolve this internally. The passenger in seat 1A has done nothing that justifies security intervention. If you want him removed, you'll need to provide specific documentation of policy violations. Otherwise, I suggest you ask Mr. Howard to take his assigned seat so the flight can proceed. Morrison felt his authority crumbling in front of 30 passengers. If he backed down now, if he admitted that the crew had been wrong, he would look weak, incompetent, possibly biased. If he continued to escalate, he would be doing so without security support, in front of recording devices, with legal experts documenting every word. He made the choice that would define the rest of his career. Officer Lopez, I'm declaring this passenger a security risk based on his refusal to comply with crew instructions. I want him removed from my aircraft. The words hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Officer Lopez stared at Morrison in disbelief. Captain, that's a serious escalation. Are you formally stating that this passenger poses a security threat to your aircraft? Yes. Based on what evidence? Based on my judgment as the captain of this aircraft. Lopez looked at Damon, seeing a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made threats, hadn't even stood up except when addressed directly. If this was a security threat, it was unlike any she had ever encountered. Sir, she said to Damon, I need you to stand up and come with me. Damon looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Officer Lopez, I want to state clearly for your body camera and for all the witnesses in this cabin that I am not resisting. I am cooperating under protest. This is an unlawful removal based on racial profiling and abuse of authority. He stood slowly, gathering his jacket and phone. As he did, his recorder caught Captain Morrison's words. Finally, some cooperation. Captain, Damon said, turning to face Morrison directly. You're about to learn something very expensive about the passenger you just decided to remove. Is that a threat? Morrison snapped. It's a fact, Damon replied calmly. Elena, he said into his phone, execute Thunderbolt protocol immediately. Full acceleration. No negotiations. The phone call lasted 15 seconds, but Dr. Kim's camera captured every word of Elena's response. Understood, Mr. Mitchell. Legal team activating. Acquisition team standing by. Skybridge debt restructuring commencing now. Preston Howard was close enough to hear the call, and something about the words acquisition team and debt restructuring made him feel suddenly cold. Officer Lopez began walking Damon toward the aircraft door, her training requiring her to follow through despite her growing doubts about the situation. As they reached the front of the cabin, Damon turned back to address the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. You've just witnessed something that will be remembered for a very long time. Not just the removal of a passenger for sitting in his assigned seat, but the moment when Skybridge Airlines chose discrimination over dignity. Captain Morrison stepped forward. Sir, you're not allowed to address my passengers. They're not your passengers, Captain, Damon replied. They're customers of an airline that's about to learn what customer service really costs. As Officer Lopez escorted him from the aircraft, Damon's phone was buzzing with messages from Elena. Legal team mobilized. Media contacts activated. Debt restructuring triggered. Thunderbolt protocol fully operational. Behind him, the first-class cabin erupted in chaos. Dr. Kim was uploading her video to multiple social media platforms. Miguel Santos was sharing updates with his 50,000 Twitter followers. Robert Hayes was calling his law firm's emergency line. And Preston Howard was finally understanding that he might have won the seat, but lost something much more important. The aircraft door closed behind Damon with the finality of a judge's gavel. At the gate, he was met by 3 additional security officers and escorted through the terminal in handcuffs, past hundreds of passengers who watched the scene with confusion, concern, and growing outrage. By the time Flight 447 finally pushed back from the gate, 43 minutes late, Skybridge. Shame was trending on social media. Major news outlets were picking up the story, and Elena Vasquez was implementing a financial strategy that would reshape the entire aviation industry. The $5 billion lesson had begun, and Skybridge Airlines was about to become its most expensive student. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Preston Howard sat in seat 1A, getting the aisle access he had demanded. But instead of satisfaction, he felt a growing dread that he had just participated in something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Dr. Kim continued documenting, Miguel Santos continued updating social media, and Robert Hayes continued taking legal notes. They all understood they had witnessed something historic, not just an act of discrimination, but the moment when that discrimination met consequences that would change everything. 37,000 feet below them, Damon Mitchell was making phone calls that would ground more than just his own travel plans. He was grounding an entire airline's assumptions about power, privilege, and the price of treating human dignity as negotiable. The flight to London would take 8 hours. The lesson in consequences would last forever. Elena Vasquez had been waiting for this call for 6 months. Standing in the 47th floor conference room of the Meridian building in Manhattan, she looked out over the Hudson River as her phone displayed Damon's message. Execute Thunderbolt protocol immediately. Full acceleration. No negotiations. She had hoped this day would never come, but she had prepared for it meticulously. 23 lawyers, 12 financial analysts, and 4 media specialists were about to learn why Damon Mitchell had earned a reputation as the most dangerous man in corporate America when his principles were violated. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena announced to the assembled team, we are executing Thunderbolt Protocol. As of this moment, Skybridge Airlines has approximately 4 hours before they understand the true cost of their decision. The room erupted into controlled chaos as laptops opened, phones activated, and the most comprehensive corporate restructuring in aviation history began with the efficiency of a military operation. Meanwhile, 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, Flight 447 was discovering that removing Damon Mitchell from the aircraft hadn't removed the consequences of that decision. Dr. Kim's video had been viewed 47,000 times in the first hour. The footage was crystal clear. A well-dressed black man being escorted off the plane in handcuffs for the crime of sitting in the seat he'd purchased. Captain Morrison's words, "Finally, some cooperation," had been clipped into a separate video that was spreading even faster. Miguel Santos was providing live updates to his followers. Update: passenger removed was Damon Mitchell, CEO of Meridian Financial. Yes, that Damon Mitchell, the guy who owns half of corporate America's debt. This is about to get very interesting. Skybridge, shame. The tweet exploded across social media as financial journalists, aviation experts, and civil rights advocates began connecting the dots. Damon Mitchell wasn't just any passenger. He was one of the most powerful men in American finance, known for his surgical precision in corporate takeovers and his reputation for turning discrimination into career-ending consequences. Robert Hayes was on the phone with his firm's senior partner. "Richard, you need to hear this. I just watched Skybridge Airlines commit the most expensive act of racial profiling in corporate history. The passenger they removed owns their debt, all of it." In London, the financial markets were beginning to react. Skybridge stock, which had closed at $47.80 in New York, was dropping rapidly in after-hours trading as word spread through international business networks. Institutional investors who understood Damon's reputation were calling emergency meetings. But the real earthquake was happening in Elena's conference room, where Rodriguez and Associates, the most feared aviation law firm in the country, was coordinating with Meridian Financial's legal team to implement a strategy they had codenamed Thunderbolt Protocol. Phase 1 is media documentation, Elena announced. Dr. Sarah Kim's video is being authenticated and distributed to major news networks. Miguel Santos has agreed to provide witness testimony. Robert Hayes is documenting potential federal violations. Phase 2 is legal action, continued Maria Rodriguez, the firm's senior partner. We're filing federal civil rights violations, breach of contract, discriminatory business practices, and passenger rights violations. The documentation is overwhelming. Phase 3, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of financial warfare, is debt restructuring. Meridian Financial controls $5.2 billion of Skybridge's operational debt. We are calling it all in, immediately. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Calling in that much debt simultaneously would force Skybridge into immediate bankruptcy unless they could secure alternative financing within 72 hours. In the current aviation market, with Damon Mitchell as their opponent, that financing would be impossible to obtain. At Skybridge headquarters in Dallas, CEO Jonathan Rivers was waking up to the nightmare that had begun while he slept. His chief financial officer, Patricia Williams, was calling with panic in her voice. "Jonathan, we have a catastrophic situation developing. Damon Mitchell was removed from Flight 447 tonight." Damon Mitchell? The Meridian Financial. Damon Mitchell? Yes, he was physically escorted off the aircraft in handcuffs. It's already viral on social media, and our stock is down 18% in overnight trading. Rivers felt his stomach drop. Every airline executive knew Damon Mitchell's reputation. He was the man who had restructured 4 major corporations in the past decade, always with surgical precision, always with devastating consequences for those who crossed him. How bad is our debt exposure to Meridian? Jonathan. It's everything. Our entire operational credit line, our aircraft leases, our fuel contracts, if he calls it in. Rivers didn't need her to finish the sentence. If Damon called in Skybridge's debt, the airline would cease operations within 48 hours. Get me everything on this incident. Video, witness statements, crew reports, passenger manifests, everything. And get our legal team to find me options. But unknown to Rivers, the legal options were disappearing as fast as his stock price. On Flight 447, word was spreading through the cabin about exactly who had been removed from Seat 1A. A passenger in business class had recognized the name when Miguel tweeted it, and the information was moving through the aircraft like wildfire. Flight attendant Carmen Rodriguez felt physically sick as she realized the magnitude of what had happened. She had profiled and removed one of the most powerful executives in American business based on his appearance. Her 20-year career was likely over, but that was the least of Skybridge's problems. Captain Morrison was discovering that his authority ended at the aircraft door. The tower was reporting that multiple federal agencies were requesting information about the passenger removal incident. The FAA, the Department of Transportation, and the FBI were all opening investigations based on viral video evidence of potential civil rights violations. But the most devastating call was coming to the Skybridge corporate office from an unexpected source. Their primary insurance carrier. "Mr. Rivers, this is Patricia Chen from Atlantic Aviation Insurance. We've been monitoring social media regarding the incident on Flight 447. Given Mr. Mitchell's reputation and the documentation that surfaced, we need to discuss immediate policy implications." Rivers felt his blood turn cold. "What kind of implications?" "Our coverage has exclusions for discriminatory practices resulting in federal litigation. If this situation escalates to the level we anticipate, Skybridge's liability coverage may be voided." "You can't be serious." "Mr. Rivers, Damon Mitchell doesn't just sue companies. He destroys them. Our actuarial department is recommending immediate policy suspension pending investigation." Rivers hung up and stared at the reports flooding his desk. Stock down 23%. Credit rating under review. Federal investigations opening. Insurance coverage threatened. All because a flight attendant had made assumptions about a passenger in a hoodie. Back in Manhattan, Elena was coordinating with news networks that were competing to break the biggest aviation scandal in decades. CNN, MSNBC, Fox Business, and the major broadcast networks were all sending crews to airports, preparing special reports on airline discrimination and passenger rights. The 6 a.m. news cycle will lead with this story, Elena reported to her team. By market open, this will be the most watched aviation story of the year. Dr. Bondron. Kim's video had now been viewed over 200,000 times and shared by civil rights organizations, legal experts, and celebrities. The hashtag #SkybridgeShame was trending worldwide, with aviation industry insiders sharing their own experiences of witnessing discrimination in airline travel. But the real devastation was happening in the financial markets as word spread about Meridian's debt position. International investors who understood leveraged buyouts recognized the signs of what Damon was orchestrating. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a complete corporate takeover disguised as justice. At 3 a.m. Eastern Time, Elena sent out the press release that would dominate morning news cycles across the globe. Meridian Financial Group regrets to announce the immediate restructuring of all debt relationships with Skybridge Airlines, effective immediately. This action follows documented civil rights violations against Meridian CEO Damon Mitchell during routine commercial travel. While Meridian has worked for 6 months to support Skybridge's financial recovery, last night's incident demonstrates corporate values incompatible with continued partnership. The release included links to Dr. Kim's video, witness statements from other passengers, and documentation of the debt relationships being severed. Financial journalists understood immediately. This was corporate warfare at its most sophisticated level. Skybridge's overnight stock price collapse accelerated. Down 31%, down 38%, down 45%. By the time European markets opened, Skybridge Airlines was facing the worst single-day stock collapse in aviation history. At London Heathrow Airport, where Flight 447 was scheduled to arrive in 4 hours, protesters were already gathering. Word had spread through social media about the incident, and civil rights organizations were mobilizing to meet the flight that had removed Damon Mitchell. Miguel Santos was providing live updates from the cabin. Crew is visibly panicked. Captain announced slight delay in arrival, but won't explain why. Passengers asking questions about the man who was removed. This flight is about to become the most famous in aviation history. But the most chilling moment came when Robert Hayes received a call from his law firm's aviation specialist. Robert, I've been researching Skybridge's financial structure. If what you're telling me is accurate, if Damon Mitchell was the passenger who was removed, then what we're watching isn't just discrimination. It's corporate suicide. What do you mean? Meridian Financial doesn't just hold Skybridge's debt. They are Skybridge's debt. The airline can't operate without Mitchell's financing. By removing him, they've essentially fired their own banker. Hayes looked around the first-class cabin, seeing Preston Howard sitting smugly in seat 1A, oblivious to the economic earthquake he had triggered. Carmen Rodriguez was avoiding eye contact with passengers, understanding that her career was over. Captain Morrison was locked in the cockpit, dealing with increasingly urgent calls from corporate headquarters. None of them understood yet that they weren't just dealing with a discrimination lawsuit. They were dealing with the complete destruction of Skybridge Airlines as a corporate entity. At 4:17 a.m., Elena Vasquez placed the call that would complete Phase 3 of Thunderbolt Protocol. Mr. Rivers, this is Elena Vasquez, speaking on behalf of Meridian Financial Group. I'm calling to formally notify you that all debt obligations held by Meridian are being called for immediate payment. You have 72 hours to secure alternative financing or Meridian will initiate bankruptcy proceedings. Rivers felt the world collapse around him. Elena, surely we can negotiate. This is about a passenger service issue that can be resolved. Mr. Rivers, this is about your employees physically removing our CEO from his assigned seat based on racial profiling in violation of federal law in front of multiple witnesses with full video documentation. This isn't a customer service issue. This is a civil rights violation that demonstrates complete corporate culture failure. Name your price. Whatever damages Mr. Mitchell wants, whatever settlement resolves this. Mr. Rivers, Damon Mitchell doesn't want money. Money was never the issue. He wants change, real change. And the only way to create that change is to demonstrate that discrimination has consequences that extend far beyond individual careers. Rivers understood he was listening to the death sentence of his airline. What are you asking for? Complete restructuring, new management, new policies, new culture, independent oversight, community investment, and personal accountability for everyone involved in last night's incident. And if we refuse? Then Skybridge Airlines ceases to exist at market open. Rivers looked at the reports covering his desk. The stock ticker showing continued collapse, the federal investigation notifications, the insurance cancellations, the media requests that were overwhelming his communications department. He was beginning to understand that Damon Mitchell hadn't just been removed from an airplane. He had been given the opening to demonstrate what real power looked like when it was exercised with surgical precision and moral authority. At 5:30 a.m., as Flight 447 crossed over Ireland for its final approach to London, Skybridge Airlines was preparing to announce the largest corporate restructuring in aviation history. The $5 billion lesson was about to reach its devastating conclusion, and every passenger on that flight was about to understand they had witnessed the moment when dignity became more valuable than stock options, when principle proved more powerful than prejudice, and when one man's quiet strength had grounded an entire airline's assumptions about who deserved respect. The most expensive seat in aviation history had cost Skybridge Airlines everything they thought they owned. By 6 a.m. Eastern Time, Skybridge Airlines' corporate headquarters looked like a war room in the middle of a losing battle. CEO Jonathan Rivers sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, crisis management specialists, and board members who had been dragged from their beds to deal with the most catastrophic public relations and financial disaster in aviation history. The numbers were devastating. Skybridge stock had opened in free fall, dropping 67% in the first hour of trading. Credit agencies had suspended their ratings pending investigation. 3 major corporate partners had terminated contracts. The airline's primary bank was demanding immediate meetings about loan covenants that were being violated in real time. "Gentlemen, ladies," Rivers said, his voice hoarse from hours of crisis calls. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Patricia, give me the financial picture." CFO. Patricia Williams looked like she hadn't slept in days, though the nightmare had only been unfolding for 8 hours. "Jonathan, it's worse than catastrophic. Meridian Financial holds our aircraft lease agreements, our fuel contracts, our operational credit lines, and our equipment financing. They essentially own our ability to fly. Without their continued financing, we have maybe 36 hours of operation left. What about alternative financing? Who's going to loan money to an airline that's being sued for federal civil rights violations by the man who controls half the aviation debt market? Damon Mitchell has effectively blacklisted us from commercial lending." Board member Thomas Anderson, a veteran of 3 decades in aviation management, shook his head in disbelief. "In 40 years of corporate crisis management, I've never seen anything like this. How did we go from a passenger dispute to corporate bankruptcy in 8 hours? Rivers pulled up the viral video that had been viewed over 1.2 million times. "Because we removed the wrong passenger from the wrong seat for the wrong reasons, and every moment of it was recorded in high definition." The video was damning. Dr. Kim's footage showed every detail. Preston Howard's entitled demands, Carmen Rodriguez's biased assumptions, Captain Morrison's authoritarian escalation, and Damon Mitchell's dignified compliance with an unlawful removal. The optics were devastating, a successful black executive being escorted from his paid seat in handcuffs, while a white passenger celebrated getting what he wanted. "The Justice Department is opening a federal investigation," reported General Counsel Michael Stevens. "The Transportation Department is reviewing our certification. The FAA is investigating potential violations of passenger rights regulations, and that's before the private lawsuits begin." "What private lawsuits?" "Rodriguez and Associates has filed a federal civil rights suit seeking punitive damages. The Passenger Rights Foundation is filing class action for pattern discrimination. The NAACP is filing institutional bias charges. We're looking at potentially hundreds of millions in legal exposure." Rivers felt the room spinning around him. "What about the crew members involved?" "Captain Morrison has been suspended pending FAA investigation. If federal charges are filed, he could lose his license permanently. Flight attendant Rodriguez has been terminated and will likely be blacklisted industry-wide. The security officers are under internal affairs review for unlawful detention." "And Preston Howard?" Stevens consulted his notes. "Interesting development there. Howard is a hedge fund manager at Sterling Capital. Our investigation found that he's been under SEC scrutiny for securities fraud. The media attention from this incident triggered additional investigation that uncovered evidence of insider trading. He was arrested this morning. The irony was staggering." Preston Howard's demand for a first-class seat had not only destroyed an airline, but had also exposed his own criminal activities to federal prosecutors. But the real devastation was still unfolding in international markets as institutional investors absorbed the implications of challenging Damon Mitchell. Meridian Financial Group wasn't just another investment firm. It was the corporate equivalent of a financial nuclear weapon, controlled by a man with a doctorate from Wharton, a photographic memory for regulatory law, and zero tolerance for institutional discrimination. Elena Vasquez was orchestrating the dismantling of Skybridge with the precision of a master surgeon. Every debt instrument, every contract, every financial relationship that Meridian controlled was being methodically restructured to force Skybridge into immediate compliance or bankruptcy. "Phase 4 is industry transformation," Elena announced to her team. "We're not just restructuring Skybridge. We're creating a new standard for aviation civil rights that will be impossible for other airlines to ignore." The pressure was working faster than anyone had anticipated. By noon, 3 other major airlines had announced comprehensive reviews of their passenger service policies. United Airlines issued a statement promising zero tolerance for discrimination in any form. Delta committed to independent bias training for all customer service personnel. American Airlines announced the creation of a passenger rights ombudsman program. The industry was transforming itself rather than risk becoming the next target of Damon Mitchell's surgical precision. At Skybridge headquarters, Rivers was receiving calls from airport authorities around the world. London Heathrow had been forced to provide additional security for Flight 447's arrival as protesters gathered to support Damon Mitchell and condemn airline discrimination. Paris Charles de Gaulle had suspended Skybridge's preferred gate access pending investigation. Frankfurt had placed additional reporting requirements on all Skybridge operations. "Sir," Patricia Williams said, her voice barely a whisper, "Meridian is offering terms for debt restructuring." Rivers felt a flicker of hope. "What terms?" "Complete management restructuring, beginning with your resignation and that of the entire senior leadership team. Independent oversight board with community representation. $50 million victim compensation fund for anyone who experienced discrimination on Skybridge flights in the past 5 years. Comprehensive bias training for every employee. Zero tolerance policy with automatic termination for discriminatory behavior. And Damon Mitchell becomes chairman of the board with veto power over all major policy decisions." Rivers stared at the terms, understanding that they represented not just the end of his career, but the complete transformation of Skybridge into something unrecognizable. "The alternative?" he asked. "Complete bankruptcy, asset liquidation. 40,000 employees lose their jobs. Skybridge ceases to exist as a corporate entity. The choice was between humiliation and annihilation." Rivers looked around the conference room at the faces of people who had built careers in aviation, understanding that those careers were ending regardless of the decision they made. Meanwhile, Flight 447 was finally approaching London Heathrow, carrying passengers who had become unwitting witnesses to the most expensive lesson in aviation history. Dr. Kim was preparing to be interviewed by BBC News about her documentation of the incident. Miguel Santos had gained 30,000 new followers and was being contacted by civil rights organizations worldwide. Robert Hayes was coordinating with his law firm to provide expert testimony in the federal investigations. And Preston Howard was sitting in seat 1A, finally understanding that his victory had cost him everything. News of his arrest was breaking on financial networks. His hedge fund was being investigated for fraud, and his demand for an aisle seat had triggered a chain of events that would follow him for the rest of his life. But the most profound transformation was happening in the aviation industry itself, as airlines scrambled to avoid becoming the next Skybridge. The incident had exposed unconscious bias that pervaded customer service across the industry, and companies were implementing changes with unprecedented speed. Southwest Airlines announced mandatory bias training for all employees. JetBlue created an independent passenger rights review board. Alaska Airlines implemented anonymous reporting systems for discrimination incidents. The changes were spreading through the industry like wildfire as executives realized that the cost of discrimination now included corporate extinction. Elena was monitoring these developments with satisfaction. The goal had never been just to punish Skybridge. It was to transform an entire industry's approach to passenger dignity. "Damon always says that individual justice is meaningless without broad change," Elena told her team. "What we're seeing today is 50 years of aviation civil rights progress compressed into 12 hours because the consequences finally match the violation." At 2 p.m. London time, Flight 447 finally landed at Heathrow to a media circus that had been building for hours. Protesters held signs reading, "Dignity can't be bumped and flying while black isn't a crime." Civil rights leaders were waiting to escort Dr. Kim, Miguel Santos, and Robert Hayes to press conferences where they would detail their witness accounts. Captain Morrison emerged from the cockpit, looking like he had aged 10 years in 8 hours. His pilot's license was under FAA investigation, his career was likely over, and he would forever be remembered as the captain who called security on Damon Mitchell for sitting in his assigned seat. Carmen Rodriguez was escorted from the aircraft by airline security, her 20-year career ended by 30 minutes of poor judgment and unconscious bias. She would never work in aviation again, but more importantly, her termination would serve as a warning to thousands of other airline employees about the career-ending consequences of discriminatory behavior. The passengers deplaned into a media frenzy, with Dr. Kim's video being played on screens throughout the terminal. The incident was dominating international news cycles, with aviation experts analyzing how a simple passenger dispute had triggered the largest corporate restructuring in airline history. But the most significant moment came when Rivers received the final call from Meridian Financial. "Mr. Rivers, this is Elena Vasquez. Do you accept our restructuring terms, or do we proceed with bankruptcy liquidation?" Rivers looked around the conference room one final time, seeing the faces of colleagues who had built Skybridge into a major airline over 20 years, understanding that those 20 years were about to end regardless of his decision. "We accept," he said quietly. "Effective immediately, Skybridge Airlines will operate under Meridian financial oversight. You have 1 hour to submit your resignation. The new management structure will be announced tomorrow morning, and Mr. Mitchell will address employees and media at 10 a.m. to explain the new direction." Rivers hung up and faced his leadership team. "Gentlemen, ladies, it's over. We've lost the company." But in truth, what had been lost was much more than a company. What had been lost was the comfortable assumption that discrimination could be exercised without consequences, that bias was a minor customer service issue, that dignity was negotiable based on appearance. Damon Mitchell had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into an industry-wide reckoning that would reshape aviation for decades. Every airline executive now understood that passenger profiling carried risks that extended far beyond individual lawsuits, risks that could include complete corporate destruction. The $5 billion lesson was nearly complete, but its effects would ripple through the aviation industry for generations. Employee training programs would be rewritten, corporate policies would be transformed, customer service protocols would be rebuilt from the ground up. And every time an airline employee looked at a passenger and wondered if they belonged in first class, they would remember the story of Damon Mitchell and the seat that cost an airline everything they thought they owned. The revolution in aviation civil rights hadn't been won with protests or legislation. It had been won with a boarding pass, a camera phone, and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to accept that his seat was negotiable because of his skin color. By market close, Skybridge Airlines had lost 89% of its value, been restructured under new ownership, and become a case study in corporate accountability that would be studied in business schools for decades. The most expensive seat in aviation history had taught an entire industry that dignity isn't just a moral obligation, it's a business imperative. The transformation was complete, the lesson was learned, and Damon Mitchell had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger or litigation. It's the careful dismantling of every assumption that made that discrimination feel safe to those who practiced it. 6 months after Flight 447, the aviation industry was unrecognizable. What had begun as a passenger dispute on a single aircraft had metastasized into the most comprehensive transformation of airline culture in history. The Damon Mitchell incident, as it came to be known in business schools and corporate boardrooms, had proven that institutional change could happen overnight when the consequences finally matched the violations. Elena Vasquez stood in the same 47th floor conference room where Thunderbolt Protocol had been launched. But now she was coordinating something entirely different. The implementation of industry-wide reforms that were being adopted faster than anyone had thought possible. The Mitchell standards have been implemented by 87 airlines worldwide, she reported to the Meridian board. United, Delta, American, Southwest, JetBlue, and every major European carrier have adopted comprehensive bias training, independent oversight, and zero-tolerance policies. The Mitchell standards had emerged from the settlement agreement with Skybridge, but their influence had spread far beyond a single airline. Insurance companies were requiring compliance for coverage. Investment firms were demanding implementation for funding. Airport authorities were mandating adoption for gate access. The financial incentives for discrimination had been carefully eliminated. Dr. Sarah Kim had become an unexpected leader in the transformation. Her video documentation of the Flight 447 incident had led to a book deal, speaking engagements, and appointment to the newly created Federal Aviation Civil Rights Advisory Board. She was using her medical expertise to help airlines understand the psychological impact of discrimination on passenger dignity. What we documented wasn't just individual bias, Dr. Kim explained to a congressional hearing on aviation discrimination. It was institutional culture that made bias feel acceptable. The changes we're seeing now aren't just policy updates, they're cultural evolution. Miguel Santos had returned to his construction business, but his social media documentation of the incident had made him a powerful voice for worker rights across industries. His testimony about witnessing discrimination had helped pass state legislation requiring bias training in customer service roles. The thing people don't understand, Miguel told a labor rights conference, is that discrimination hurts everyone. When airlines profile passengers, they're also training employees to see people as categories instead of individuals. That damages the workplace for everyone. Robert Hayes had left his corporate law practice to establish the Passenger Rights Legal Foundation, using his expertise in transportation law to help travelers who experienced discrimination. His firm was handling dozens of cases that had emerged as passengers gained confidence to challenge unfair treatment. Before the Mitchell incident, airlines could discriminate with impunity because passengers had no effective recourse. Hayes explained to a bar association meeting, "Now there's real accountability, real consequences, and real change." But the most dramatic transformation was happening at the airline that had once been Skybridge. Now operating as Meridian Airways, the company had become a laboratory for dignity-centered aviation service that was setting new industry standards. Damon Mitchell had kept his promise to transform rather than destroy. As chairman of the board, he had implemented changes that went far beyond policy updates. He had rebuilt the entire corporate culture around respect, dignity, and genuine customer service. "We don't just train our employees to avoid discrimination," Damon explained to Harvard Business School students during a case study presentation. "We train them to actively promote dignity." Every interaction, every service moment, every passenger contact is an opportunity to demonstrate that respect isn't earned through status. It's owed through humanity. The financial results were extraordinary. Meridian Airways had achieved 98% customer satisfaction ratings, the highest in industry history. Employee satisfaction had increased 340%. The airline was profitable, growing, and attracting top talent from across the industry. Treating people with dignity, it turned out, was not just morally right, it was financially smart. But Damon's most important innovation was the Community Oversight Board, which included representatives from civil rights organizations, passenger advocates, and community leaders who had the authority to investigate any discrimination complaints and recommend immediate corrective action. "The goal isn't to eliminate bias completely," Damon told the Oversight Board during a quarterly meeting. "The goal is to create processes that catch bias quickly, address it honestly, and learn from it effectively. Perfect people don't exist, but perfect processes can be built." The board's effectiveness was demonstrated when it handled its first major test, a complaint from a Muslim passenger who felt profiled during security screening. Instead of defensive corporate responses, Meridian Airways immediately investigated, acknowledged the problem, retrained the involved personnel, and implemented new protocols to prevent similar incidents. The passenger became a vocal advocate for the airline's commitment to continuous improvement. This approach was being adopted across the industry as airlines realized that transparency and accountability were more effective than denial and deflection. The old model of corporate crisis management, deny, delay, defend, had been replaced by acknowledge, address, advance. The transformation extended beyond airlines to airports, hotels, rental car companies, and other travel-related industries that recognized they could become the next case study if they didn't proactively address discrimination in their operations. International aviation authorities were implementing the Mitchell standards as requirements for route authority. The European Union had made bias training mandatory for all airline personnel. Asian carriers were adopting dignity-centered service protocols. African airlines were implementing community oversight programs. "What we're seeing is globalization of civil rights standards," explained Dr. Angela Washington, a Howard University business professor who studied the Mitchell incident's international impact. "One man's refusal to accept discrimination has created worldwide pressure for institutional change." The academic community had embraced the incident as a perfect case study in stakeholder capitalism, the idea that companies must serve all stakeholders, not just shareholders. Business schools were teaching the Mitchell case as an example of how moral leadership could drive financial performance. But the most profound changes were happening in individual interactions between airline employees and passengers. The culture of assumption and profiling that had dominated aviation for decades was being replaced by genuine hospitality and respect. Carmen Rodriguez's termination had sent a clear message to thousands of airline employees. Bias has career-ending consequences. But more importantly, the comprehensive training programs implemented industry-wide were helping employees understand unconscious bias and develop skills for respectful service. "We used to train employees to identify problem passengers," explained Jennifer Walsh, Meridian Airways Director of Service Excellence. "Now we train them to create positive experiences for every passenger. The difference in employee satisfaction has been remarkable. People feel good about their work when they're helping rather than policing." The changes extended to airline management as well. Executive compensation was now tied to customer satisfaction metrics and discrimination incident rates. Managers were evaluated on their ability to create inclusive environments rather than just operational efficiency. Captain Morrison's license suspension had become a cautionary tale throughout the aviation industry. Pilot training programs now included modules on passenger rights, de-escalation techniques, and the legal consequences of discriminatory decisions. The authoritarian culture that had characterized many cockpits was being replaced by collaborative decision-making that considered passenger dignity alongside safety requirements. "The old model taught pilots that they were kings of their aircraft," explained Captain Maria Santos, Meridian Airways Director of Flight Operations and the first Latina woman to hold such a position at a major airline. "The new model teaches that they're servants of the flying public, with awesome responsibility to treat every passenger with respect." The financial impact on the industry had been substantial, but positive. Airlines that implemented comprehensive dignity training saw increases in customer loyalty, employee retention, and operational efficiency. Companies that resisted change found themselves facing boycotts, regulatory scrutiny, and difficulty attracting investment capital. Insurance companies had become powerful drivers of change by requiring bias training for coverage and offering premium discounts for airlines that exceeded Mitchell standards compliance. The financial incentives now supported, rather than undermined, dignified treatment of passengers. "The market has aligned with morality," Elena explained to the Meridian board. "Companies that treat people with respect are more profitable than companies that discriminate." Damon didn't just create justice, he proved that justice is good business. Investment firms were using Mitchell standards compliance as a factor in airline valuations. Environmental, social, and governance investing had expanded to include dignity metrics alongside traditional financial measures. Pension funds and endowments were divesting from airlines that failed to meet civil rights standards. The technology industry had also responded by developing tools to help airlines identify and address bias in their operations. Artificial intelligence approaches were being trained to recognize discriminatory language in customer service interactions. Data analytics were helping airlines identify patterns of differential treatment that might indicate unconscious bias. But technology was only part of the solution. The real transformation was cultural, requiring airlines to examine their fundamental assumptions about passengers, service, and dignity. "You can't software your way out of bias," Damon explained to a technology conference. "You have to culture your way out of it. Processes and policies support change. But change happens when people decide to see each other as human beings deserving of respect." The transformation was being measured in ways beyond traditional business metrics. Passenger complaint rates about discriminatory treatment had dropped 89% industry-wide. Employee reports of witnessing discrimination had decreased 76%. Customer satisfaction scores across all demographic groups had reached historic highs. More importantly, the changes were creating positive cycles of behavior. Employees who were trained to provide dignified service felt better about their work. Passengers who experienced respectful treatment were more cooperative and pleasant. Airlines that created positive cultures attracted better employees and more loyal customers. This is what corporate evolution looks like, Dr. Kim explained to medical students studying organizational psychology. External pressure creates internal change, which creates cultural transformation, which creates sustained improvement that benefits everyone. The Mitchell incident had also inspired changes beyond aviation. Hotels were implementing dignity training for front desk staff. Retail companies were revising customer service protocols. Restaurant chains were addressing bias in seating and service decisions. The lesson transcends airlines, Miguel Santos told a workforce development summit. Any business that serves the public has to grapple with bias. The Mitchell incident showed what happens when bias meets accountability. Most companies decided they'd rather change proactively than be changed reactively. The legal profession had also been transformed as passenger rights became a specialized area of practice. Law schools were offering courses in transportation civil rights. Bar associations were providing continuing education on discrimination law. The legal framework that had once protected airlines from accountability had been restructured to support passenger dignity. But perhaps the most significant change was in public consciousness about acceptable behavior in customer service situations. Passengers were no longer willing to accept discriminatory treatment as normal. Bystanders were more likely to speak up when they witnessed bias. Social media had become a powerful tool for documenting and challenging institutional discrimination. The Mitchell incident didn't just change airline policies. Robert Hayes explained to his law students, it changed public expectations about how people should be treated in commercial settings. That cultural shift may be more important than any specific policy change. As the 6-month anniversary of Flight 447 approached, the aviation industry was preparing for the first annual Dignity in Aviation Conference, hosted by Meridian Airways and attended by airline executives, civil rights leaders, government officials, and academic researchers from around the world. The conference would showcase the remarkable transformation that had occurred since Damon Mitchell was escorted off his flight in handcuffs. But more importantly, it would chart the path forward for continued progress in creating an aviation industry worthy of the trust placed in it by the traveling public. The $5 billion lesson had become a $5 billion transformation, proving that individual acts of courage could reshape entire industries when supported by principled leadership, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. 1 year later, Damon Mitchell stood at the same gate where he had been arrested 12 months earlier. Miami International Airport bustled with travelers who had no idea they were witnessing a moment of quiet victory. Not over an airline, but over the assumptions that had made discrimination feel acceptable for too long. He was boarding Flight 1, Meridian Airways' flagship route from Miami to London. The same route, the same aircraft type, but a completely different world than the one that had existed before a flight attendant named Carmen Rodriguez decided that a man in a hoodie didn't belong in seat 1A. "Mr. Mitchell, welcome aboard." The voice belonged to James Wilson, a young black flight attendant who had been hired as part of Meridian Airways' commitment to workforce diversity. James had been working for a regional carrier when he heard about Meridian's transformation, and he'd applied because he wanted to work for an airline that treated dignity as a core value. "Thank you, James," Damon replied, noting the genuine warmth in the greeting. "How are you finding your work here?" "Honestly, sir, it's the best job I've ever had. We're trained to see every passenger as someone's family member deserving respect. It makes coming to work feel like serving a purpose rather than just earning a paycheck." Damon smiled as he settled into seat 1A, the same seat that had cost Skybridge Airlines $5 billion and transformed an entire industry. But today it felt different. Not like a battlefield, but like a symbol of progress that had been earned through quiet courage and principled action. Dr. Sarah Kim was in seat 2B, returning from a medical conference where she had presented research on the psychological impacts of discrimination in customer service settings. Her documentation of the original incident had become a case study taught in medical schools, business programs, and civil rights courses around the world. "Dr. Kim," Damon said, recognizing her from their shared experience 12 months earlier. "How has this year been for you?" "Transformative," she replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned that bearing witness to injustice was a form of activism. "I've testified before Congress, written a book, and helped train airline employees to recognize bias. But mostly, I've learned that documenting truth has power when people are ready to hear it." Miguel Santos was in his usual seat, 3A, flying to London for another international construction project. His social media following had grown to over 200,000 people who valued his perspective on workplace dignity and civil rights. He had become an unexpected voice for working-class Americans who face discrimination in various forms. "Miguel," Damon said, turning to acknowledge him, "thank you for speaking up when it mattered." "Mr. Mitchell," Miguel replied, "I was raised to believe that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit. What happened to you was wrong, but what's happened since then proves that one person's courage can change everything for everyone." Robert Hayes was reviewing legal documents for the Passenger Rights Legal Foundation, which had handled over 400 discrimination cases in its first year of operation. The foundation had achieved a 94% success rate in securing justice for travelers who experienced bias, proving that accountability was now real and enforceable. As Flight 1 prepared for departure, Captain Maria Santos, no relation to Miguel, despite sharing a surname, made an announcement that would have been unthinkable in the old Skybridge culture. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Meridian Airways Flight 1. I'm Captain Santos, and on behalf of our entire crew, I want you to know that every person on this aircraft is valued, respected, and welcome. Our commitment is to provide safe passage and dignified service regardless of who you are or where you come from. At Meridian Airways, every passenger is our priority." The announcement received spontaneous applause from passengers who recognized they were flying with an airline that had proven its commitment to treating people with respect. This wasn't corporate marketing. It was cultural transformation that passengers could feel in every interaction. As the aircraft taxied for departure, Damon reflected on the journey that had brought him back to this moment. The investigation into Skybridge's discriminatory practices had revealed dozens of similar incidents that had been covered up, dismissed, or ignored. Passengers had been profiled, humiliated, and removed based on assumptions about who deserved first-class service. The pattern had been deeply embedded in airline culture for decades. But the most remarkable discovery was how quickly change could happen when the incentives aligned with justice. Airlines that had resisted civil rights progress for 50 years had transformed themselves in months when discrimination became financially unsustainable. Insurance companies, investors, and customers had collectively decided that bias was bad business, and corporate behavior had evolved accordingly. Elena Vasquez had been promoted to Chief Transformation Officer at Meridian Financial, overseeing similar culture change initiatives across multiple industries. The Mitchell standards had been adopted by hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and service companies that recognize the business value of dignified customer treatment. "What we learned," Elena had explained to Harvard Business School students, "is that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's operationally inefficient. Companies that profile customers spend more time making assumptions and less time providing service. Respect is actually the most cost-effective business strategy." The financial performance of companies that embraced dignity-centered service had validated this approach. Meridian Airways was the most profitable airline in the industry. Customer loyalty was at unprecedented levels. Employee satisfaction had created a virtuous cycle of better service, happier customers, and more sustainable business operations. But for Damon, the most meaningful changes were personal rather than financial. Letters from passengers who felt safe flying for the first time. Messages from airline employees who took pride in their work because they were helping rather than policing. Stories from travelers who had experienced genuine hospitality instead of suspicious interrogation. The real victory, Damon had told Elena, isn't that we saved an airline or changed an industry. It's that we proved dignity isn't negotiable and respect isn't conditional. Those principles are worth more than any amount of money. As Flight 1 climbed toward cruising altitude, Damon looked out the window at the Atlantic Ocean below. Somewhere over these same waters 12 months earlier, Preston Howard had been sitting in seat 1A, believing he had won a victory over an uppity passenger who didn't know his place. Today, Howard was in federal prison, serving an 8-year sentence for securities fraud that had been uncovered during the investigation into his discriminatory demands. Carmen Rodriguez had moved to London, where she worked for the city council issuing fines for littering. Her aviation career was over, but she had become an unexpected advocate for bias training in customer service roles. Her story was used in workshops to demonstrate how unconscious assumptions could destroy careers and damage companies. Captain Morrison had lost his pilot's license and was working as a dispatcher for a trucking company. His authoritarian approach to passenger management had become a case study in how not to exercise authority. Aviation schools used his decisions as examples of how bias could override professional judgment with catastrophic consequences. But the most important transformation was in the thousands of airline employees who had learned to see passengers as individuals deserving respect rather than categories requiring management. The culture change had rippled through the industry, creating better working conditions, improved customer service, and more sustainable business practices. "James," Damon said to the flight attendant, "what do you think has changed most in the past year?" "Honestly, sir, it's the way we see our job. Before, airline employees were taught to identify problems and manage them. Now we're taught to create positive experiences and solve challenges. It feels like the difference between being a security guard and being a host." Damon nodded, understanding that James had captured the essence of the transformation. The aviation industry had evolved from a culture of suspicion and control to one of service and hospitality. The changes weren't just policies. They were fundamental shifts in how companies related to customers and employees. As Flight 1 reached cruising altitude and the cabin settled into the quiet hum of efficient travel, Damon reflected on the words he had shared with a congressional committee investigating discrimination in transportation. Change doesn't require anger or confrontation. It requires clarity about values and consistency in defending them. When we decided that dignity was non-negotiable, the entire industry had to choose between evolution and extinction. Most chose evolution. Those who didn't chose irrelevance. Dr. Kim was editing the final chapter of her book, Bearing Witness: How One Flight Changed an Industry. Miguel was updating his social media followers about the continued progress in workplace dignity initiatives. Robert was reviewing cases that demonstrated the ongoing effectiveness of passenger rights enforcement. But Damon was simply flying to London, in seat 1A, wearing a comfortable hoodie, confident that no one would question his right to be there based on his appearance. He had paid $14,000 for this seat 12 months ago, but the real price had been the willingness to stand up for principle when silence would have been easier. The lesson had cost an airline $5 billion, but it had created value that couldn't be measured in financial terms. An industry had learned that respect was profitable, dignity was sustainable, and justice was good business. Most importantly, millions of travelers would fly with the confidence that they belonged wherever they had earned the right to be, that their dignity wasn't subject to the assumptions of others, and that accountability existed for those who confused prejudice with policy. As Flight 1 crossed the Atlantic toward London, Damon closed his eyes and smiled. The sky was clear, The flight was smooth, and the future was bright with the promise of continued progress toward a world where dignity truly was universal and respect was genuinely unconditional. The $5 billion lesson was complete, but its legacy would endure forever. In policies rewritten, cultures transformed, and lives lived with the assurance that justice, when coupled with principled action, could move mountains and ground assumptions that had seemed unshakable. The most expensive seat in aviation history had taught the world that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting the system, but from demonstrating what the system could become when guided by courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. Justice doesn't require an audience, but change does. And the change that began with one man's quiet refusal to accept discrimination had transformed an entire industry, proving that individual acts of courage, when amplified by principled leadership and strategic action, could reshape the world for everyone who followed. If this story of quiet courage and transformational justice moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that dignity is never negotiable and respect is always earned through character, not status. Don't forget to hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to fly with dignity, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove individual actions can change entire industries when guided by unwavering principle and moral clarity. Remember, you belong wherever you've earned the right to be, and your dignity is not subject to the assumptions of others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story where justice takes flight and courage changes everything.